And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This essay is about what happens when something we offer, especially something we've made, believe in, or feel proud of, is received differently than we hoped. It centres on moments where the response is unexpected. Laughter, when reverence was expected, refusal, where legacy was intended. But instead of framing these moments as failures, the essay explores them as opportunities for deeper forms of recognition, relationship, and self-revision. It's not about correcting the misalignment, it's about staying present within it. The essay weaves together recognition theory, Hegel, Honneth, generational ethics, Jonas, de Beauvoir, and aesthetic vulnerability, Nietzsche, Cavell, to argue that true connection doesn't depend on being admired or understood. It depends on how we respond when we're not. Ultimately, the essay proposes a redefinition of legacy, not as what is preserved or applauded, but as the freedom we create for others through how we behave in moments of mismatch. The central idea is that presence, especially presence that doesn't demand affirmation, is more enduring, more loving, and more ethically meaningful than perfection. They laughed, not cruelly, not to dismiss, just honestly, the kind of laugh that slips out before anyone decides what it means. Something had been shared, crafted, offered, remembered, and in return came this sound. It didn't wound, not exactly, but it did interrupt. It fractured the moment into something stranger, part memory, part misunderstanding, part mirror. And in that split, something quietly essential happened. Not recognition in the usual sense, not admiration or gratitude, but something closer to intimacy. Because it's one thing to be seen in your strength, it's another to be seen in your effort. That effort doesn't ask to be praised, it just wants to matter, to land. But sometimes it doesn't. It floats, misses, or turns back toward you in a shape you didn't intend, and the instinct is to explain, to correct the angle. But the better move, the harder one, is to stay, to let the response stand without trying to redirect it. Because what's being measured isn't the quality of what was offered. It's the quality of your presence after it wasn't quite received. This is what makes the moment more than awkward, what makes it tender, what gives it weight. The offering was real, so was the misalignment, and neither is more important than what followed. Not withdrawal, not performance, but attention. An openness that doesn't demand to be validated. A kind of staying that makes room for the unexpected. That's where the recognition lives. Not in agreement, not in reverence, but in a kind of friction that keeps the room honest. You gave something. They gave something back. And in between those two gestures, one planned, one instinctive, a space opened. A space that asked, will you stay here even now? It's tempting to think that love arrives in applause, but sometimes it arrives in the silence after the laughter. In the soft exhale of someone who didn't mean to wound you and doesn't quite know what to say now. In your choice not to fill that space with noise, just to be there, still, as if nothing broke, as if something began. There's something disarming about being met with honesty that isn't shaped to spare you. Not cruelty, not indifference, just the kind of truth that emerges when someone is close enough not to perform. It catches you off guard, not because it's sharp, but because it's accurate. It knows you. It doesn't embellish or applaud. It simply reflects. And in that reflection, you see the limits of your offering, not as failure, as contact. This is where the ethics begin. Not in the intention to give, but in the response to what the gift becomes once released. It might not be cherished, it might not even be understood. And your task isn't to make it so. Your task is to remain, to not pull away when the distance between what you meant and what they felt becomes visible. That space is the site of real inheritance, not of possessions or achievements, but of how to be with each other when something doesn't quite fit. To love someone across a generational line is to allow them the right to refuse what you thought would matter. It's to honour their freedom, not just in theory, but in practice, in how you respond when they look at what you made and say without malice, this isn't mine. That refusal isn't a wound. It's a sign that they are far enough from your orbit to see you clearly, that they're not trying to become you, that they are becoming something else. And still, you stay. You stay not because your offering succeeded, but because it didn't. You stay to show that your presence was never conditional on being admired, that the gift was never the work, it was the act of giving, and now the act of remaining. What emerges in that moment isn't resolution, it's relationship, one that doesn't need to agree, one that doesn't seek alignment, one that can survive laughter, misfires, and difference without retreating. That's the deeper legacy. Not the artifacts, but the ability to stay with someone long enough for them to tell you the truth. And still stay after they do. To be met with laughter when you expected reverence is to be returned to yourself. Not the self you narrate, but the one they actually see. It startles, not because it's unkind, but because it's accurate in a way you hadn't prepared for. You realise suddenly that your offering is not being measured against intention, but against intimacy. They know you too well to pretend. And in that closeness, their reaction isn't critique, it's contact. It's the sound of someone encountering something you shaped and deciding without hesitation to respond as themselves. This kind of recognition doesn't flatter. It doesn't frame you in soft light. It simply holds the moment up and lets it be what it is. And your response to that is everything. Do you explain? Do you correct? Or do you remain unguarded, slightly dented, still present? Because the real test isn't whether the work landed. It's whether you can still be there when it doesn't. There is an ethic to this, a way of loving that doesn't insist on being understood, that doesn't hinge on the reaction, that remains not to persuade, but to accompany. And in that act, quiet, almost invisible, a new kind of bond forms. One not built on shared taste or mutual admiration, but on the willingness to let someone else's honesty stand. What shifts then is not the relationship. It's the posture inside it. The offering ceases to be a performance and becomes a conversation. The legacy stops being a claim and becomes a question. Not, will they carry what I made, but will they feel free enough to refuse it without losing me? And in that refusal, if you're listening, there's a gift, not of affirmation, but of space. They are telling you in the language they trust, this is not for me. And you, if you're listening closely enough, can reply without words, I know, and I'm still here. There's a tenderness in staying visible after something doesn't land, a kind of grace that has nothing to do with elegance and everything to do with remaining soft in the face of dissonance. It's easier to retreat, to explain, to reframe the moment into something more flattering. But what's braver and rarer is to stay exactly where you are without turning the moment into a lesson. To let the mismatch breathe. This is what makes a moment matter. Not that it proves a point, but that it holds one open. You gave something, they gave something back. Neither gesture was perfect, but both were real. And in the tension between them, a different kind of meaning emerges, not in what was said or shown, but in what was allowed to remain unresolved. That's what separates performance from presence. Performance seeks resolution. Presence allows incompletion. It trusts that the relationship can carry the weight of ambiguity, that love doesn't require agreement. That understanding isn't always necessary for connection. In fact, sometimes the most honest connection is forged in the space where expectations fall apart. This doesn't mean diminishing what was offered. It means letting it shift, letting it exist outside your control, letting it become whatever it becomes once it reaches someone else, and letting their reaction, however light, however misaligned, shape the next gesture. What changes then is not the value of the work, but the role it plays. It becomes less about what it was supposed to do and more about how it moved through a moment, how it opened something, even if it didn't open what you intended, how it revealed a fault line you didn't know was there. And maybe that's what makes it lasting, not because it succeeded, but because it allowed something else to begin, a new way of seeing, a new way of being seen. Not as perfect, not as right, but as willing to be wrong and still stay. What lingers isn't the moment itself, but what it made possible. Not the laughter, but the way no one left the room after it. Not the offering, but the quiet that followed when it didn't land. That quiet held something. Not resolution, not clarity, but presence. A kind of emotional architecture began to emerge, not through agreement or affirmation, but through the absence of departure. You stayed, they stayed, and in that staying, something shifted. This is the shape of revision, not of the work, but of the self. Not through retreat or apology, but through continuity, through the choice to remain in relation even when the dynamic changes, even when what was offered is gently declined, even when the image of what might be dissolves into what is. This is where dignity lives, not in being understood, but in being available to be misunderstood without vanishing. That availability is not passive. It's a form of generosity. It says, I can hold your reaction. I can let it stand. I can exist beside it without needing to be justified. And in doing so, it opens a different kind of future, one not built on persuasion or legacy, but on trust. Trust that the connection matters more than the impression, that the relationship can outlive the moment. This is how love matures. It lets the shape of the other remain strange. It doesn't need their laughter to stop. It listens to what the laughter means. It understands that even misalignment can be a form of intimacy if the response to it is gentle. If the response says, in effect, I see where you are. I see that it's not where I hoped you'd be, and I'm still here. The moment passes, the room breathes again, nothing dramatic shifts, and yet everything has changed, not because of what was said, but because of how you stayed when it didn't go the way you planned, because of the silence you didn't rush to fill, because of the offering you didn't take back, because of the presence that remained, asking for nothing, except to be with what was. Some things are remembered not because they were profound, but because they were witnessed without flinching. This wasn't the most important thing ever said or the finest thing ever made, but it was real. It was brought into the world and held up to the light. And when the light refracted strangely, when the laughter came or the silence fell, no one turned away. That's what stayed. Not the work, but the willingness. We imagine impact as something we deliver, a line, a moment, a gesture that shifts the room, but maybe impact is something quieter. Maybe it's what remains after the gesture falters, after the meaning slips, after the air clears and all that's left is how we looked at each other when it didn't go as planned. There's a kind of intimacy in that aftermath, a kind of integrity in not rushing to repair what cracked. This isn't failure, it's friction. It's what happens when something offered meets something real. And when the offering breaks slightly on contact, what matters is not whether it held. What matters is whether you did, whether you stayed soft, whether you kept listening, whether you let the moment speak, even when it said something you didn't want to hear. That's the test. Not of the work, of the posture, of the self. Not whether it landed, but whether you landed with, whether you let it become part of the space between you. And whether you stayed in that space long enough for the next thing to begin, not a performance, not a correction, but a continuation. A second gesture, less certain, more open, maybe smaller, but no less true. Legacy is often misunderstood. It's not what they remember. It's what they're free to become because of how you were with them when it didn't work. It's the dignity of not needing to be right. It's the courage to let the thread fray. It's the love that outlasts the shape it first arrived in. That's what stays, that's what carries, that's what echoes. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.